Hey, what's going on everyone? Mecha here, and welcome back to another edition of the Fire Emblem Archetype tier list. Today we are doing the generals, the big generals, the promoted ones. I've done a knight one before, but I've never done a general one before. I left off some people from the last one, the knight one, because they were all unpromoted ones, and these are the promoted ones, technically. There's some caveats there, but I'll get into that. If you're wondering where these have been, because it's been a while since I did an archetype tier list, I do like 3 editions now of the big tier lists every month to make sure that every character gets in, and yet the videos don't get too long. They're still very long, which means I have had less time to do other videos like this one, but I still plan on doing them every now and then. There's not as many archetypes left anyway, so spreading them out a little bit seems appropriate. But yeah, let's get into the low move, high defense, high strength, high HP guys, the big generals. I'm going to be honest, I don't think any of these are going to make it into the top tier, and I don't think any of you were expecting me to put them there. But I'm going to take a moment to explain why that is, and why movement is so important to tier list settings and efficiencies and LTCs and stuff like that. Because I still see some misconceptions about this every day. Some people think I only like high movement units. Some people think I only use mounted units or flyers or people with high mobility. I just don't like using lower tiers. That is a different problem altogether. I actually enjoy using bad characters, and I've enjoyed a couple of characters on this list, in fact. A couple of characters on here I actually enjoy using and can find a purpose for. In fact, that's one of the things I'm going to focus on today, is explaining what these guys can be used for, if not for something like an LTC. I don't actually play LTC that much when I play on stream or when I play Let's Plays. I tend to just play casually, like most people do, and I use bad characters like everyone else. I've trained Amelia in my FE8 Iron Man, I've trained Wendy in my FE6 Iron Man, I've used tons of bad units. Right now in Echoes, I'm playing with Jesse, I've trained Est, I've trained numerous other silly units that you wouldn't really think of using in an LTC setting. But LTCs are a good standard to judge units by for a competitive thing like a tier list. For something where you really want your units to perform, you know, you want to maximize their potential, and you want to see what happens if everyone maximizes how good they can be. You want to, like, low turn counts forces units to function at a high level. If a unit, if one unit, like broadly speaking, if one unit can clear a chapter quickly and another one takes a lot longer to help you clear it, then that former unit is better. It's just a way to judge units by. If one unit takes 2 turns to kill an enemy, the other one takes 1 turn, then the unit that does it in 1 turn does it better. If one unit survives 5 enemies and the other unit survives 2 enemies, then the unit survives 5 enemies is generally better, etc. So by going for low turn counts, you cannot turtle through maps like you could normally. And as a result, some unit types just work less well than others. And no archetype demonstrates this better than people like Armor Knights and Generals. This is the reason why Oswin isn't very highly ranked by veteran players, by people who try to LTC the game, even though he's very good for beginning players and for people who just, you know, just want to get through the game for the first time, because he's pretty much foolproof. But it doesn't make him the best at, for example, securing side objectives. Those are another thing that Armor Knights tend to not be very good at, is getting to some place quickly, because usually it's like a thief running away with treasure, or a character trying to run away, or a village that's being under attack by thieves. Stuff like that, they're not very good at that kind of thing. So they're less versatile than other units. Of course, generals have their own problems. Sure, they have good defense usually, good HP, so just good physical bulk. But I said physical for a reason, because they're usually very vulnerable to magic. Sometimes you have to deal with armor slayers. They tend to have low accuracy sometimes, especially when using 1-2 range, so sometimes they can only really viably use a 1-range weapon like a Silver Lance, and anything else just makes them do poorly. Siege magic can be a big problem for them, sometimes status stabs can be a big problem for them. They have a lot of flaws. If it doesn't involve just taking a direct hit from the enemy and hitting him back, then they tend not to do well. And of course their speed is very low most of the time, so they don't usually double attack, which means an enemy that they attack tends to survive, and then they can run off to get healed, or they attack one of your other units, or they're in the way now and you have to get rid of them too. Generally one running units is better, and there's a lot of units in Fire Emblem that manage to be both durable and offensively capable. Think like FE10 Har, for example. When you have a unit, one of those guys on your team, if you have like FE7 Marcus or FE8 Seth, then having a high defense unit on your team doesn't really do very much. There's only so much use for high bulk on a team, but high offense you can almost always do more with. So that's not a reason why they're not very high tier. Also, they're not highly available. A lot of these units on here, they join like halfway through the game or later. We have Lawrence from FE1 and FE3. We have as well as FE12, well, not FE12, FE11. We have Shima from FE3 Book 2 and her remake version, FE12. We have Hannibal from Fire Emblem 4 Generation 2. We have Xavier from Thracia. We have Douglas from the Binding Blade. Wallace from the Blazing Blade. I know he starts as a knight in Limb mode, but he starts as a pre-promoted general in Hector mode, and I didn't put him on a knight's list last time, I don't believe, so that's why he's on here. Technically, he could be classified as both a knight and a general, but I decided to throw him in with the generals. We have Seronio in FE9 and FE10, Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. We have Braum from Radiant Dawn and Ghatri from Radiant Dawn. In Path of Radiance, they are knights, they are armor knights, but in Radiant Dawn, they're basically generals. I mean, Radiant Dawn is a weird game where almost everyone starts at tier 2, so they start like Lance General, Axe General, that kind of stuff. And you could classify them as unpromoted armor knights if you wanted to, but I don't think I had them on my previous tier list either, so that's why they're on here. I have Gilbert from Three Houses, and I have Frederick from Not Awakening from The Last Promise. So those are the generals I've got. As you can see, there's not that many, but at least that means I get to go in depth on each of them. So we'll start with Lawrence, not Lawrence Hellman Gloucester, but you know, the old-fashioned one. I don't have an FE1 portrait on this tier list maker. I can't add any portraits to that, in case you're curious. It's just made like this. I'm glad they recently added Gaiden, but Gaiden doesn't have any playable generals, so that doesn't really help. But here we got Lawrence. Can I just say straight up, like, Lawrence has great facial hair, but so do a lot of these other guys. Like, I get that Shima doesn't have any, and I mean, Wallace is basically bald, but a lot of the other ones just have a beard or a mustache or both, which I think is, like, super great. Wallace, or Lawrence, also adds a nice eye patch to the mix, and that's about where the good things end. He's a general, and like all these characters, and he joins like chapter 20, I want to say, like FE1 and FE3, and Shadow Dragon have like a little bit different numbering system, but he joins very, very late. So there's only, I would say, about like 4 maps plus maybe Shadow Dragon guidance for him to contribute, generally speaking. I swear I'm not doing that on purpose. And he has a high weapon level, to the point where you can use the Grativ as a base level. I've told you I was going to try really niche things to talk about, to praise them, because his stats really aren't very good, especially in Shadow Dragon, where you can just freely reclass. You can have a general if you want, but generally you don't want one. And the problem with general in Shadow Dragon, it can't reclass to any other class that can use lances, so the lance rank he has is only usable if you put him on a class that only has 5 move, and that's kind of sad. And he doesn't really do a whole lot else. He has a high bow level too in Shadow Dragons, so he can become a, what's the class called? Horseman. You can use the Parthia, in fact, and snipe wyverns, for example. That can be sort of useful, but the problem with reclassing him out of general is his bulk becomes really bad because his personal bases just aren't very good. And on hard 5, I know for a fact enemies will one-round him. This is nothing special, like almost everyone gets one-round on hard 5, but it's kind of sad that it happens to like one of the best generals. At this point in the game, a lot of the enemies have brave weapons, and in endgame they even have force brave weapons. So yeah, being a general, not very good in that game. In the original, like FE3 and FE1, he doesn't get one-rounded because the enemies are a lot weaker, and I mean, there's no reclassing, and the enemies, there's no hard 5 or anything, so the enemies are just kind of whatever. But it also means you don't really have much purpose in overkill bulk. Like, you can imagine that if your other characters can survive a lot of enemies, then you don't really need a super strong general to tank the enemies for you. You'd rather use someone with more offense or more mobility to tank the enemies, because they can actually get stuff done within one turn. But in FE3 Book 2, or Book 1, I keep saying Book 2, FE3 Book 1, at the very least, one cool thing about Lawrence is that he can use the Grativus indoors. A lot of other characters are forced to dismount when they go indoors, and that puts him in like a Sword Claw class. But I think he's like the only character besides Draug and maybe like Roger that actually isn't Rutger cut from. I think Roger is cut from FE3 Book 1, but don't quote me on that. The point is, he's one of the few people who can use the Grativus at base level. He has a high enough weapon level to do it, and that's kind of cool. But other than that, he doesn't really have much of a purpose, and I don't think there's much of him in the, like, you don't really have the deployment slots for someone like this. Like, normally these kind of guys are like kind of nice. You can deploy them without having to waste XP on them, but in this case, you're still gonna have better candidates. So I don't think he's super bad, because at least he does some things at base. I'm gonna put him in D tier for now, but I really don't think there's any salvation for him overall. I could see him move down into like, I think I actually put him in E tier for my big tier list. You know what? I'm gonna see if I can find a worse character than him. I'm gonna see it before I move him down. I do think the Shadow Dragon, I think the Horseman option is like good enough to put him up here at least, better than his original. Then we have Shima from FE3 Book 2 and New Mystery. The one thing that amuses me about Shima is that her strength is laughably low. It's so fucking terrible. I looked it up earlier, it was like 8 strength, I think, at that point in the game, because this is also another super late joining general. It's like the Sunset of Gra or something is what the chapter is called, where you have to like not kill her soldiers, and they also won't attack you, at least in FE12, and then she joins if you don't kill any of them, and that's kind of cool. But she just has nothing going for her besides that. She has a high defense though. But at that point in the game, again, you don't really need it. FE3 Book 2 enemies are a bit more threatening than FE3 Book 1, quite a bit more in fact. But I don't think she really helps against them in any sort of way. I do actually feel that Shima is worse than Lawrence by a good amount. I'm going to put her in E tier. As much as I love the idea of like a female general with like kick-ass design, I know her heroes art is really good. But I'm just not seeing it. I don't think there's anything she can do. Unfortunately, she's in the female set class in FE12, and I mean, she doesn't have access to the free reclassing that males do after you've beaten the game once. The female side still has a lot of good classes in it. She can become a paladin, for example, and a wyvern, so it doesn't really hurt that much. I just think it's sad that they only have access to half the classes that males do, but most of the male classes are kind of poopy anyway, so it's whatever. I would say she's a little better in FE12 than she is in FE3. I think that she's more purpose in FE12 if you had to use her. Like, if you put a gun to my head, I'd rather use her in FE12, I think. You can make almost anyone good in FE3 because of scroll abuse, or like not scrolls, the star shards. It's basically the same thing as FE5 scrolls. Boost her growth a little bit. That can work to make her good. You'd have to try really hard, but at least you can use the Grativis too, so that helps a little bit. Then we have Hannibal in FE4 Gen 2, another pretty lackluster unit overall, sadly. One of the cool things about generals in that game is they can use all physical weapon types. You can use swords, lances, axes, bows. Sure, half of those are worthless, but it's cool. Bows in particular are kind of useful. Actually, I really like Hannibal for arena fights. First of all, he has Pavis. I've heard you have to pronounce it like this. So it just negates like level % attacks of the enemy, and his base level is like 20, so that's already like a 1 in 5. It's basically like extra avoid for him. And then bows will make him attack arena enemies at range. And at range, most enemies have weaker weapons. They use like hand axes and javelins instead of something like a silver lance. That makes him a little better. His bulk is super good in the arena too. He has a lot of base HP and defense. So generally against any physical enemy, he will win. You can also use swords against magical enemies. You can use like the hero sword, for example, just get a free win there. So arena-wise, no problem. Like if Hannibal could just 1v1 enemies all day, he'd probably do fine. But of course, mobility, I've said before, it's pretty bad compared to other units, but in FE4 it's especially daunting because of the rogue bonuses and just the fact that almost all good units have mounts at this point when he joins. Like for the record, I'm not going to count against him that he's like hard to recruit, and the same goes for Xavier and all these other guys who are like hard to recruit. For some reason that's like a staple too. Like ever since Lawrence, a lot of these are like super difficult to recruit. Hannibal with his 5 leadership stars, like doing a pincer attack on you with Servants, and then you kind of have to put him to sleep or like sneak by him to recruit him with Corporal. Super big pain in the ass. I'm not going to count it against him. I'm going to count his utility from the moment he turns blue, because that's the way I've always been doing it, and that's how that's some consistency that I want for my tier list. So the fact that he's hard to recruit doesn't count. But even once you recruit him, there's just not a lot of added value to having him on your team. There's never an enemy that starts in your range, I do believe, for Hannibal. He always like walk towards it, and if he has to walk towards it, then someone else is just going to beat him to it. Also, Chapter 10 onwards, where you can basically start using him properly, because in Chapter 9 there's really not that much to do for him. Almost every enemy is magical in some way. There's so many dark mages. Fenrir just 2-shots him with ease. Jormungandr, same thing. It's like once he gets up close, he can just kill them fine with any weapon you want, like the hero bow or a hero sword or something else. He doesn't have pursuit, but he has like adept, I guess, so you can cheese something with that. But generally, if you want him to kill something, you should probably use a hero weapon because he doesn't have pursuit. And there's just not much else you can do. I usually put him in like castle guard duty, and there's not much need for castle guards in FE4. But the chapter he joins in, you get like the 3-headed dragon assault, and he can hold off an entire squadron of dragon knights if you want to. I think sometimes even he has like too much defense and he won't get attacked, but I don't remember that for sure. But yeah, Hannibal just doesn't have anything to do in FE4, and it's kind of like a joke unit. But at least it's fun to use him in the arena. I really enjoy using him to just... Like, there's one arena fight where there's like a wyvern, and if you fight him at range, he has a javelin. And if you put a bow on Hannibal, it's like the most unfair fight I have ever seen. So that's one part I enjoy about Hannibal, but God, he's bad. He's awful. I'm not sure if he's worse than Shima overall, actually. But I do think it's one of the worst units in FE4. Like, I think Arden is better overall. I think, like, Tiltu is better. I think Corporal is better. I can't think of a worse unit, honestly, in FE4. And now we have Xavier. Now, Xavier, very, very famous for his bad recruitments. And like I said, I'm not going to count it against him. But I understand perfectly why people skip it. There's like this really good comic by Racecar Art that's like August explaining to Leaf how he has to recruit Xavier, and he's like, fuck it, we'll just kill him. I don't blame him one bit. I do recommend everyone who plays FE5 and feels like playing it again, if they didn't recruit Xavier on the first playthrough, just try it at least once. It's an experience that every final player should go through at least once. It's not the most fun thing ever, I will say. There's definitely some frustration in there, but you'll feel very accomplished for doing it. I'm not going to go into depth. I still need to make that guide on how to recruit Xavier. As for how good he is, I actually really like Xavier as a unit in FE5, and there's a couple of reasons why he works. I'm not going to say he's like the best endgame unit whatsoever, but at least they tried to make him strong this time. At least they tried to make the general class, or, you know, him, good. So he has a couple skills. He has Wrath, so automatic counter on an enemy phase. I think if you use Orson, you know how good this is. It's just, okay, you get attacked, you kill them, pretty much. That's pretty much all there is to it. And his other skill is a cost, which means he extends the battle by 1 round if he has more attack speed and more HP than the enemy has at the start of the battle. More speed is not a guarantee, because Xavier, like all generals, is pretty slow. More HP will usually be true, because his HP is pretty high. So if he activates this, the enemy is pretty dead, but they probably were already. Like, Xavier can 1 round. That's like the big thing about him. He joins with a Master Axe, so you can give him one of the other Master Axes you get too. You can't use Master Lances because he'll hilariously start with E-Lances. I don't believe you can use any other like super high rank weapon, but Master Axes and like the Brave Axe are good enough to just make him 1 round stuff. And usually in FE5, combat is not at such a high demand that you need other people to have these kind of weapons. Like, who else is going to use these weapons? Like Dagdar maybe, or Ralph. But you usually have enough of these weapons going around that you can give one to Xavier. And he also has Wrath to just enemy face counter stuff. Of course, enemies in FE5 won't attack you if you have too much defense to be damaged, so that can sometimes kind of backfire on you. But usually it's easy to find a spot where Xavier can be good. You can give him the scroll to stop him from getting crit if you're worried about that. And then you just need to watch out for magic, and you're pretty good. He can be a pretty good defender in chapter 20. That's the defend chapter, the last one for Thracia. And other than that, sure, his mobility is bad, but in FE5, by that point in the game, you're kind of moving around using warp a lot of the time. Either that, or, you know, the fight takes place close to the starting point. But either way, there's usually a method to getting Xavier to, you know, an important choke point, and I just start killing enemies. I can kill Dark Mages in 1 round. He can use the Brave Bow, very important weapon that I forgot. He has a high bow rank, and he has to be able to use it, so he doesn't lose any more speed from using it. Even if he did, whatever, he just attacks twice to kill something, because his strength is so good. You can kill Flyers if you see any of those. And he's just good at combat, really, and the mobility isn't as big of an issue when you're just moving around with warp anyway. Like in that chapter where you fight Raedric, if he starts near, well, really any group, he could just start fighting without much of an issue. And the final chapter, he's also super good because you just start right next to the enemies there. So again, mobility not a big issue. Sure, his availability is still terrible, but I think compared to all of these units on this list here, I think he's by far the best one so far. I can think of like 1 or 2 other characters that like come close, but overall, I'm still gonna put him here. Like, sure, he doesn't have enough availability or enough viability overall to be like top tier. Like, he's not a late game staff user, but I still think he's leagues better than what we've got so far. I would even say he's like 2 tiers better than Lawrence, honestly. But I'm not feeling up to putting him a B tier right now. I would sooner put Lawrence down to E tier if I had to make a choice there. In fact, I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to move Lawrence down because I think some of the next characters are going to go in D tier. Douglas, for example. D is for Douglas, I think. Douglas from the Winding Blade, he joins in 16, well, 16X. You have to keep him alive in 16 and join in 16X. And again, another big pain in the ass to recruit, but at least it's not a turn-based guiding requirement, so it's easier for new players to get. But still a pretty big, like, threshold to get over for new players, I find. Like, it's usually... Just recently, there was like a question in Reddit's general question thread about like how to recruit Douglas because it's such a pain, and I perfectly understand that. So once Douglas joins, what does he offer to you? Well, FE6 is another one of those games where you have a lot of high mobility units that are pretty strong, especially Percival, Milady, Alans with an A support, Zeus if you've trained him. So pretty hard to get Douglas to the action, but he has some purposes that you can do. Whether you go to Sakai or Ilya, Douglas is pretty much invincible to the main enemy type there, either Nomads or Pegasus Knights. And he's pretty bad against magic, which exists to some extent, but not enough to where he's completely unviable. He can tank some choke points. There's this long, bad, outdated strategy of using Douglas to rescue Roy in Sakai and then carry him towards the throne and use that to keep him safe, because Sakai features a lot of spots where just enemy nomad troopers just come spawning out of tents on enemy phase. You can't really do much about them, and they might kill Roy. And I've always found that a funny strategy, because it was clear, like, whoever suggested it, I think it was Inui, it just doesn't work. It's just because, like, even on paper it doesn't work, because the moment you drop Roy, he dies, and he needs at least one turn out on the field in order to seize. I guess you could dance him, but then how do you get the dancer over there, you know, without her dying? Or, I mean, I'm assuming it's Lauren, but if it's Elfin, sure, he dies too. So, like, how does that work? They still have to kill the boss, so you have to send people along with him, so Douglas is not going to get attacked. So, like, I think the better strategy is just make sure you protect Roy with actual units around him when playing casually, or use the warp staff to bypass the problem altogether. Either way, super, super annoying to deal with in Sakai, and Douglas can sort of help tanking it. The problem with Douglas, I think he really embodies the big problem with hit rates in FE6 and like bad weapon types. A lot of people complain about like weapon locks in FE6, like, oh my god, these units are sword locked, or these units are locked to lances or to axes, which is bad, but really there's no good weapon type to be locked into. All weapons kind of suck, and I think even if Douglas could use swords, it wouldn't be that great. But lances and axes kind of suck on him because his hit rate is going to be like super terrible when using like a javelin or a hand axe, or even like a killed lance would be okay, I guess, but generally his skill just isn't too good, and he has all the other problems that I mentioned at the beginning, where like sure, his like defense is good and HP is good, but anything outside of those two stats, well, and his strength, I guess, has issues. Like, he's going to get doubled, he's going to die to an armor slayer, magic units are really good against him, siege magic is really good against him, status stabs are probably going to have 100 hit on him always, and he doesn't one-run enemies, and FE6 has a lot of those like promoted magic enemies that use physic on an enemy you don't kill. So if you put Douglas up against like a group of enemies, chances are they will never die, because they just get healed over and over. It depends on the circumstance, but I'm just saying Douglas is almost never going to be the best solution to the situation at hand. But he has situational usefulness. I still think he's better than these guys. He has more availability to work with because he joins in like chapter 16 out of 24 rather than like chapter 20 out of 24-ish. So I still think he's better than these units out here. But I would still not put him like very high up. I don't think he's as good as Xavier is, for example. Now, next up is Wallace. I remember the first time I played FE7 and I got Wallace and I promoted him, and he was like, yeah, go ahead, break your weapons on me. I'm a giant among you, or something. It's super fucking funny. And he was pretty good in limb mode for that 2 chapters you have him, and because it takes forever to play Fire Emblem the first time you play it, those 2 chapters felt like a very long time, and I thought Wallace was very good, and then he just vanished and never saw him again. Yeah, that's Wallace, and well, that's not my only positive experience with Wallace, but it's probably the best experience I ever had with him. Because FE7, another one of those games where the enemies is just not very threatening, so you can use better characters with slightly less tankiness, but much more offensive mobility, and you get generally the same benefits, but a lot more of that than you would otherwise get with the Bald Wallace. He only joins you if you go the Lloyd route, which I usually do, because I don't tend to train all 3 of my lords, and even if you are using all 3 of them like in your main team, I still don't find that they always make it to level 17 on average, because that's like the requirement basically. Like the total has to be 50 or over in order to make it to Lloyd to Luna's chapter, where you get Geats, and I don't think they're worth that, especially not in Hector hard mode. But in Hector like normal mode or something, I can see you recruiting Wallace more often. The other thing with Wallace is I used him in negative growths for a little bit. I used to like block at choke points. There's like this part in Pilflower of Darkness where there's like a general that comes at you from the start and he drops a speed win, which would be good to get early, but you want to wait with killing him if you want to get Harken, because he's one of the easier pre-promotes to leave alive. You can only kill 1 pre-promote if you want to get Harken, from my memory. So I usually kill the bishop in the center that has Purge, because he keeps harassing me, which means there's no room to kill that general, so holding him off is good. So I remember what I did is like I put like a light rune there, and then once that expired I had Wallace stand there and make sure he couldn't get to me, so he wouldn't like kill Merlins and stuff. That's basically how I use Wallace in my whole life. Other than that, I never really use him. I don't find him useful. I don't need his defensive powers in FE7, and that game gives you so many like good flyers and good paladins. You don't really want to have a guy like this on your team. Also, Hector hard mode just like limits your deployment slots by so much that you just don't have room for this guy. This is a problem that's like, it occurs in other Fire Emblems, but Hector hard mode is especially tight on those. So I don't think there's a whole lot of room for Wallace there. I do think like if you had to use these, you won't have a super bad experience with Wallace, because he's still gonna, you know, stay alive and do fine. He's not terrible at combat, other than the fact he's never gonna double anything, even in FE7 where enemies are super slow. But I think, for example, like the high weapon hit in FE7 in general and the lower enemy avoid makes it more tolerable to use him than using Douglas. So I still think Douglas is more useful overall because FE6 is harder. So there are more times where, you know, the niche of a general comes in handy. But if you want to hit enemies, Wallace is generally better. It's weird. But I think he's overall less useful than Douglas. But I would put him in the same tier. I still think he's better than these guys. Then we have both incarnations of Tyronio. We have him in Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. Path of Radiance, what he has going for him, I think, is most importantly Resolve. You cannot unassign the skill and assign it to someone else like you can in Radiant Dawn, so it really is his skill. If you remove it, it's just gone. And that makes him very interesting, because in that game, it boosts your strength and your speed and your skill, I do believe, by, I believe, 1.5 if you get him below half HP. I find getting him there quite a challenge in FE9 because the enemies don't hit that hard, and Tyronio's defense is of course really good, and his resistance, you know, it's not as good as his defenses, but it's still like okay. And FE9 enemies are just kind of wimpy. I was recently watching that stream that I tweeted by a friend named Rad, who through some bet was playing FE9 Maniac mode, 0% growths with no crit forges, so basically maximum pain, and Tyronio was sort of useful there because FE9 doesn't have that many good pre-promotes that last for the entire game. It's like Tanith is your best unit, and from there's not that many good units left, like Stefan and Khalil and Larjo and like Janaf. They just don't hold up as well. So Tyronio actually is like stood out as a fairly useful character. And it's nice that he has access to the 1-to range package and like lances and axes, and he's got the bulk to survive enemies, which is quite a rarity in 0% growth. So that was pretty cool. But Resolve was still quite hard to activate, because even at 0% growth, enemies just don't hurt him that much. And it's hard to get someone to half HP and then keep them alive reliably without just relying on dodge tanking. Because if you rely on dodge tanking, you might just die anyway. So Resolve is a kind of a tricky skill to use sometimes. But Tyronio can sometimes make it work. But in vanilla FE9 experience, like not Maniac mode, not 0% growths, not no crit forges, well, you can forge if you want. But in the English version, there's no crit glitch, so... the point is, Tyronio is, again, it's like an FE7 and an FE8, where you just don't need his durability, and you have much better mobility available. But I would still put him in like the same class as like Wallace and Douglas, where, you know, if you have to use one general, you could use this one and it wouldn't be that bad. It's just, it's not going to add anything to your army. So I think I'm going to put him below Douglas. So I still think Douglas has more potential in like the Sakai and Ilya routes to be sort of useful as a defensive like line holder, and there's like sort of niche uses for him. But Tyronio, I just don't think you ever want to use in vanilla, but he can be okay, I guess. Now, if you tend Tyronio, now this is a general that I will use every Radiant Dawn playthrough, because they actually put him in spots where I want to use him, which, you know, it sounds strange, but he joins very early for a change in 1.6. And he's available for only 2 chapters in Part 1 and 1.6.1 and 1.6.2. And then again available for 2 chapters in Part 3, 3.12 and 3.13. And he's actually pretty good because he joins like a tier above your other units, and he's super powerful. He just one-rounds everything in his joining chapter. And his mobility is roughly the same as your tier 1 units. Sure, you have some other units with more mobility like Volug and Soth and Zyhark. And you have Jill, of course. But Tyronio is still like super powerful in those chapters, and you want to minimize the amount of times you use him if you want to train your Dawn Brigade. Like if you kill like an entire army with Tyronio, then people like Jill and Nolan are going to be very sad. They won't get much XP. But oh boy, Tyronio's so strong. He's so strong there, so you kind of want to use him for like as much as it makes sense. Kind of like a Jagan unit basically in 1.6.1 and 1.6.2. It's a shame he's not available for like chapters beyond that in Part 1, because he would have been very useful. But I guess the Black Knight is kind of like what he does in one endgame at least. And in Part 3, he doesn't stand out as much anymore. He doesn't double and one-round everything, but he's still defensively powerful. He can hold the line in 3.13, for example. And in 3.12, he has like a really good starting position. Most of the units start like on the right side of the map, but he starts on the left, and you can't even move him off of it, so he's kind of stuck there. But it's a good thing. I usually just put him like one ledge below where he starts, and just like choke that point to kill enemies, or at least prevent them from going up the ledge. And I find that generally pretty helpful. Like, you can kill enemies from range with the hand axe, and durability is never an issue because his defense is sky high, and people have to hit him from down letke, so with like minus 50% hit, that's just never going to happen. If it does, he's going to take the hit just fine. And then in 313, every enemy is one range, so if you want to, you can put like anyone on the ledge and they won't be able to get up. Like, you can use Meg or Fiona or yellow units and it won't matter. But if you need like a choke point where someone actually needs to like fight, then Geronio can do it, and there's plenty of spots where you have to do that too. So Geronio I think is fairly good. Now as long term, like after that, like part 4 is like whatever, it's kind of gross, kind of bad. He's forced on Tibarn route, and I don't think there's a whole lot of use for him there. By part 4 you have better options, but like I always say about part 4 and Radiant Dawn, you don't usually have enough units to have like great combat all around, because you have to spread out so many different units across 3 different like routes. And very rarely are you sending the best units to Tibarn route, because it is probably the route where the least amount of like intensive combat happens, since most part 4 maps are routes, but the last part 4 map for Tibarn is kill boss, so you probably don't want to send as many good units on Tibarn route as the others. So that gives the units that do go to Tibarn route an extra niche in his first Tibarn chapter, where you do actually have to route, but you have less tools available. So in that way, Geronio can be useful, but it doesn't double enemies. He will usually 2-shot, but like if you don't kill enemies in one round when you're routing chapters, they're going to take like over twice as long, and you don't want to face reinforcements or lose like your bonus XP. So I wouldn't recommend relying on Geronio. I would still recommend sending a couple of like good units with him to make sure that you don't have to solo it with Tibarn basically. So overall performance is pretty good for Geronio. It's just there's only 4 chapters where he's really good, but he does like really stand out there. So I'm putting him up here with like Xavier. I think he's overall, I'd say they're about even. They even have like similar facial hair to go with it. I would say overall Geronio is more useful to more players, especially if you don't recruit Xavier. But as I said, I'm not counting that against them. I think Geronio is just a very useful unit to have in some specific chapters. But I wouldn't put him like here, because this is more for like units that are just useful for a bigger portion of the game, basically is what it comes down to. His availability is just too low. Next, we're going to have a Braum moment in Radiant Dawn. Like I said before, Radiant Dawn units all start at tier 2. Geronio is very clearly intended as a pre-promote. He joins at tier 2 when most units are tier 1. But these guys, they just join as tier 2 among other tier 2s. But still, they are generals technically, so it's just kind of as generals. So I think Braum is, for me, he's usually just a unit I use when he's like force deployed, and after that, not a whole lot after that. After that, not a whole lot else. He's probably your best unit in the Nephany chapter, because he's only him and Nephany and then like Heather. And I wish you didn't have to use him as much as you do, because he's not that good, but you kind of got to go with it. At least he's very bulky, but he can still die in that chapter if you just have every enemy come at him. But oh boy, that chapter is just a huge pain. It's not really thanks to Braum, it's more like Nephany's fault than anything else, and Heather's fault. But Braum is more like the guy that makes it tolerable, because he can take the enemies on, he can kill them. He has this skill called Disarm that I always find very silly. In Radiant Dawn, you can make enemies like unequip their weapon if that skill activates. It's like skill percent, I do believe. And that would be useful if it stopped them from attacking, but instead what it does is just makes them unequip for your phase, and the next enemy phase is just equip it again. So the only use is to make them unequip it so like Heather can steal their weapons, which doesn't really happen all that often anyway, because Heather's strength is just Garbo, but I guess it's sort of useful, I guess. But very situational and generally unnecessarily bothersome. And after part 2, you can take this arm off of him, put it on someone else. So it's not really like his thing anyway. Radiant Dawn, I mean, hate to sound like a broken record, but you don't need that bulk, and the mobility really hurts. Like, there's some maps in Radiant Dawn that really are intended to punish horses, like the swamp map, river map, and desert map, but they also really end up punishing armor units even harder, which really hurts Braum and Ghatri in the long term. And Braum's stats aren't even really that good overall. His speed is very lacking, so you don't really have any reason to use him beyond his force deployment. I still think that force deployment by itself is worth putting him in like D tier over E tier for, and like beyond the Nephany map, you can use him in like 2 endgame if you want to play it legit, and you can do some things like shoving and like holding up a choke point in the chapter where you have like Niluchi and Lucia and Liana and stuff. So that kind of usefulness is there, but for a long-term unit, Braum isn't very good. But I do have a video of Braum by himself tanking all of 3-5 and winning by doing absolutely nothing. So that's also a good Braum moment. So yeah, I think it's more useful than these guys. Next we have Ghatri, and Ghatri is statistically very useful in in Radiant Dawn. And by statistically useful, I mean his stats are very high. That's a very elaborate way of phrasing it. I like to say that Ghatri infused the Night Ward from FE9 in his blood because his speed growth went like crazy. He has got really good growth all around. Like when Radiant Dawn first came out, Ghatri was very high on tier lists because, God, the good HP, strength, and speed, and defense, and like, what can't this guy do, right? And he hits so hard when he first joins, and he never seems to like really slow down stat-wise. And you can do that thing where you bonus experience abuse. Like, he's gonna cap ram those stats I just mentioned very quickly. And from there, he has a high enough base level to promote if you want to, or you can bonus experience to get his worst stats up. Like, you can get better res on him, for example, if you wanted that. Or I think his skill is very good too, but you can get that up too if you didn't cap that somehow. Either way, his stats are phenomenal. So what's wrong with Ghatri? Why has he fallen off on tier lists? Well, first off, as people get better at the game, generally bulky characters like Ghatri and like Oswin just end up being less valuable on tier lists because people figured out better and more reliable strategies using higher mobility units. Basically manage to do things faster without slowing down to make use of Ghatri. So bulk just becomes less useful overall that way. And also Ghatri in part 4 has some issues. He's going to tank just fine. He might even double enemies depending on what his speed cap is at, or what his speed stat is at. Because the problem is like his caps are just a little bit low, and especially for end game, he doesn't reach some of the doubling thresholds you would want him to. So I'm not sure if he has the speed to double, for example. I'm not sure exactly what thresholds he fails to hit in part 4 because I've never used Ghatri long term, but I think that's like the general issue with him. I'm pretty sure he's not going to double Sword Masters, for example. I'm not sure if he can one-round Generals in, for example, Ike's like chapter with Oliver, like 404. I'm not sure if he can one-round... I'm pretty sure he can one-round like Paladins on Mikaya's chapter, for example, but I don't think he's very good to bring that route anyway because it's a desert. I just think he slows down in part 4, but I haven't used him in a long while, and I actually want to use him when I'm playing Radiant Dawn again. Whenever I get to that part, because I'm kind of curious about his long-term potential. I always know that he's good in like part 3. I used him in like late part 3 once, and I found that, like, for example, the swamp map, his bulk is total overkill, but the lack of mobility really kills his usefulness there. And from there, I just haven't really found a great use for him. But you can probably just send him to a corner of the map and route that part all by himself. That will be no problem. I just worry that like Ghatri just isn't as mobile as I would want a character to be. Yeah, it's just lack of mobility and to a lesser extent lack of speed that really makes him great. But I've never been able to use Ghatri for more than just the early part 3, so I don't really have much long-term experience with him. But his stats are good, and the like 3P and 3-1, the first 2 chapters of Ike's campaign, he's pretty useful. I find him like pretty reliable there, and I don't think he doubles there, but I think his strength and defense by itself make him useful. Like, everyone has their own place in the early parts of the Guerrilla Mercenaries, and he can be very useful there. So I'm going to put him up here with Ghatri and Tironio, on the provision that he's somewhat useful in later part 3 and part 4, but as I said, I haven't really had much experience with him. So I'm just going to assume he's like a bulky character that 2 KOs enemies and sometimes doubles, but usually doesn't. That's my impression of him, at least, from what I've seen on our playthroughs. So yeah, I'm going to put him like below... I'm not entirely sure. I think he should be below Tironio, but I'm not sure about Xavier. I'm going to put him like below Xavier for now. And I could see him moving down, but D tier Ghatri in Radiant Dawn seems really wrong. And I know a lot of people who play Radiant Dawn for the first time probably enjoy Ghatri a lot. And I would think he's like one of the better characters. And I can't blame him for him. Like, his stats are super, super good. At least growth-wise. And he gets a lot of plus ones on level ups. I think that might be it. He gets a lot of plus ones on level ups, and that feels good. But it doesn't always translate to like a very, very strong character. Next is Gilbert from 3 Houses. I think his class is called Fortress Knight, but it's basically a general, so we might as well go with it. And he's a very unique character. He's Blue Lion's exclusive, but he only joins in Hunting by Daybreak as opposed to earlier. Most characters just join in part 1. I can't really come up with many other characters that join in part 2, like Yuritsa, I guess. And I guess like some church route characters sometimes, but even they have like equivalents in part 1 sometimes. Gilbert is pretty weird in that aspect. I think most people kind of meme on Gilbert because of his terrible base speed. I think he joins with like 2 or something in part 2, which is super low, like 5 maybe. But part of that is just a low Fortress Knight base, and if you bump up his class to something else, like if you qualify him for Wyvern Rider, which I've done in Manding in like within like 1 or 2 months. Then he can just become like a Wyvern Rider, or my first Blue Lions playthrough, which was hard New Game Plus, I made him like a Great Knight, and his speed becomes like a lot more serviceable than that. It's not as low as it looks like on the first time. So Gilbert, I wouldn't say he's like so underrated that he's like a waifu character, but I think a lot of people write him off just because of the way he appears. And of course, when people play Three Houses, they get very attached to the characters in part 1 because that's kind of how the game makes it. You bond with them for a long time. Gilbert's is kind of like this kind of boring ass dude that, you know, leaves a family behind for no good reason other than his own guilt tripping, or him guilt tripping himself. So he's not a very relatable character. He's like kind of an asshole. So I don't think a lot of people really like Gilbert, but I don't think he's as bad as I thought he was. Like I made like I remember on my 24-hour stream, I made like a tier list and I put Gilbert as like one of the worst units on there. But, you know, I wasn't as familiar with Three Houses back then as I am now. So I don't think Gilbert is that bad anymore. He has some good utility at base. He can smite at base. He can rally defense. I believe he can defense stack to make him very good. I don't think he's very good for the Aegis shield though, which is like usually a very big part of defense stacking because he doesn't have a crest. So trying to tank with that on you is pretty bad. You just end up taking 10 damage. So, yikes. But yeah, his defense can be made pretty good if you wanted to. If you're committed to making speed your dump stat, as Rengar usually puts it, then Gilbert is a pretty good candidate for that. Just have him face tank a bunch of enemies, and if anything, I think more casual players will enjoy using Gilbert to defend Ashe from the many enemies in Hunting by Daybreak, trying to make him survive. So at least he gets credit for that. I usually just like skip Hunting by Daybreak nowadays, or I let Ashe die, or I just don't care, or something like that. Or I just don't play Hunting by Daybreak, I just play Crimson Flower, because fuck that chapter. But it can be useful for that too, I guess. So, I've never properly used Gilbert as a Wyvern Rider. I haven't noticed him being very good. He's like an interesting personal skill. I think he's like -2 defense, or -2 damage taken when he has a battalion on him, so kind of like the reverse of Lawrence's skill. That's pretty nice as well for defense stacking. But I've never had a great experience using Gilbert overall. I remember at one point, I tried using him, but the problem was I ran out of flying battalions, and he's like one of the characters I cared the least about, so I couldn't really like properly represent how good he would have been for me. So that experiment didn't really work out. For now, I think I'm gonna put him like in the like bottom of C tier. I don't think he's better than that, but he does have some good utility at base. Maybe he's better than Ghatri, but I'm putting him like here for now. I don't think he's B tier. Like missing half the game is quite a lot for a character that's not like super standout, but I think he has some niche uses that put him above the other characters. I think in particular, smite at base and access to some good classes is pretty nice. And finally, we have Frederick from The Last Promise, and he's pretty bad. I'm not gonna lie. I only put him on here because he didn't have that many characters, but I like putting The Last Promise in here whenever I can get away with it. And Frederick joins at the very, very end. I think it's the last character to join you, along with, is her name Becca? It's like an archer. Rachel, that's it. She kind of looks like Rebecca. And at that point, you really don't have a purpose for him. There's not that many chapters left. And from the top of my head, the chapters you have left at that point is like, basically the 2 tower, there's like 2 tower maps, and like there's like the chapter where you have to kill all the senators, I think. And that's basically it. He's not useful in any of those. And it's the chapter where he joins, I find him like okay. I was never like super, I wasn't impressed, but I was like, I don't know why everyone calls him like super bad, but I think it's just availability and like being superfluous compared to all the characters you've raised. You're much better off focusing on like actual good units at the point in the game than trying to make use of him and like Rachel. But he's alright. He's, you know, he can tank enemies, he can sort of hit them back, and you know, you can protect Rachel from dying at the very least if he gets like a choke point. But that's really about it. It's nothing like that helps your army that it really has. But you know, I appreciate him being there. He's a good dude. He's not very good. I'll put him like around here. I don't think anyone really cares about him if I put him in the wrong place. But just let me know if you think he's in the wrong place, and I'll put him somewhere else retroactively, or maybe not. We'll see. Anyway, that is the tier list for the generals. I told you they wouldn't end up very high. I was maybe expecting someone to be up in here in the B tier, but I guess not. There's things they can do for all of them. They're just not super good in the tier list setting, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't enjoy using them. They are fun, they are tanky, and the no damage sound is one of the best sounds in Fire Emblem. And if you want to hear it, these guys are your best bet. So that's the archetype tier list. Let me know any other archetypes you want to see in the tier lists, and of course look forward to more big tier lists because I'm going to be working on those very soon. Thank you for watching. Have a good day. Peace around, and goodbye.